Welcome back, class, history scholars, to another edition of our class, our U.S. History Survey, going through 1877. We should now have just finished a section on revolutionary early national America. We talked about the Revolution, the Federalist era. We've fought our way through the War of 1812, and now this is the beginning of a new unit in our course, and really a new era, one that some will eventually call an era of good feelings. But as you're going to see, this is not just a time of nothing but good feelings in America, that there's total unity. There's going to be plenty of bad feelings too, and still partisan divisions. But for a brief time, it looked as if perhaps partisanship could be behind us. The Federalist Party had been badly defeated and further crushed by this War of 1812. And so for a while, it seemed like there's really just going to be one party, and the United States is riding high after winning this second war for independence, defeating Great Britain, or at least not losing. A tie is good enough. And there's a great sense of patriotism. But as I mentioned, we're going to see several things that make this not just an era of good feelings, but really uh, a continuation, perhaps, of some of the partisanship that existed before. Only, as you'll see, there'll be new party names and new political leaders. This is a transition from one generation of political leadership, the early national period. Now we're entering something we'll call the Jacksonian period. We don't really have a lot of other periods in American history that are so associated with one figure, but Andrew Jackson is that kind of figure here. That he's either loved or he's hated, but he's certainly a pivotal character, one of many, but a pivotal character in this period, going from 1815 on to about 1848. We call all that the Jacksonian period, even if, of course, he's not president that whole time. He's still a major figure. Well, let's get started here on this era of good and bad feelings. The reason this period takes that name early on is that there is a newspaper man that looks at the election of James Monroe, notices how much support there is for Monroe. He wins the 1816 election quite easily. And 4 years later, in 1820, he's going to do almost what George Washington did. He's going to win nearly every electoral vote there was. Now, in some ways, this is even more impressive than George Washington because by now they had adjusted the way that we do elections. After the 1800 election, the debacle there about who's going to be the real president, is it going to be Jefferson or is it going to be Aaron Burr? It was a tie in the electoral college. Well, a new amendment changes a little bit how we do the electoral college, and now the electors no longer cast two votes like they did before. That seemed necessary when everyone was so protective of their own state, their own former colony. So we don't have the same kind of two votes per elector. That's where George Washington got one vote from all of those electors. Now it's different. There's new states. There's more electors, and they're all just casting their votes. Well, they almost all vote for James Monroe. One dissenter casts a vote for John Quincy Adams. And there's even some rumor that maybe that vote was just thrown away so that Monroe could not match what George Washington had already done, unanimously elected. The point was, certainly there was a reduction in partisanship. The Federalist Party had had really dominated in the 1790s before anyone really acknowledged that there are parties. But they had suffered a lot in the early 1800s. They never won the presidency again. They never really gained in numbers through the early 1800s. And the War of 1812 was even more damaging because this Hartford Convention, where a number of Federalists were complaining about the war and complaining about the power that the president had in starting this war. They called it just Mr. Madison's war. Um, that meeting seemed very unpatriotic when the war ends on a real positive note at the end, the war or the Battle of New Orleans. So Federalists, they were already on their last legs, and after 1812, they really are going to fall apart. Still exist for another couple of elections, but each time their candidates are getting less and less national recognition. So a newspaper man now in James Monroe's presidency says, this marks the era of good feelings. We've got partisanship behind us. America's riding high on this patriotic nationalist wave. It seems like an era of good feelings. But of course, that's just one newspaper man's opinion. The name may have stuck for this brief period of time, the late 18 teens, early 1820s. Um, but there was certainly um, more to it than there's just an era of absolute happy feelings. James Monroe's presidency is what we are referring to, though, when we talk about an era of good feelings. And in a lot of ways, Monroe is kind of the last of his generation that will be a president. He fought in the Revolutionary War. And in most pictures of him, you'll still see him in the revolutionary looking um, wardrobe. You'll have the knee breeches and the socks that pull way up and attached to those short knee breeches. It's not like pants that go all the way down to your ankle, as becomes more customary deeper into the 19th century. Monroe seems kind of a throwback, still a Virginia plantation owner, part of that Virginia dynasty, and a Revolutionary War figure. Um, that famous picture that shows George Washington crossing the Delaware, Monroe was the other man in the picture you should recognize holding the flag there. So Monroe was sort of the last of this Revolutionary War generation that would have been old enough to have fought in the Revolution and now to become new president. We won't say much more about his actual policies and president, but he's another two-term Virginia president. The Thomas Jefferson Republican Party really does dominate. But we should also note that he had a very prominent um, Secretary of State. And John Quincy Adams is quite well noted for his role here. And often people will look back and say he's the most successful Secretary of State the United States has ever had. And technically, he was alive during the Revolution too, but very young, not really old enough to be a fighter in the war or a direct participant. But as the son of John Adams, and following his father, John Adams, into Europe, he's been involved in diplomacy and government service from his very early years, his teenage years. And he does many significant things as the Secretary of State. He will settle the boundary issue between the United States and Canada, at least from where the Great Lakes are over to where Oregon Territory would be. Um, so basically, that line of latitude, when you look across a map and you see there's just a straight line there between the United States and Canada, 49 degrees north latitude. Well, that's accomplished under James Monroe's presidency and John Quincy Adams' um, his time as Secretary of State. Um, there's also something we'll talk a little more about, but um, Adams will also um, head this treaty that obtains Florida from Spain. Um, when we get to more about Andrew Jackson, we'll learn a little more about how this comes about. But Adams plays the diplomatic role. Andrew Jackson may play another more active role to help make this possible. Adams-Onis Treaty with Spain. Um, and probably most famously, of course, is while John Quincy Adams is in this role, he will help initiate something called the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this was a policy of the U.S. which emphasized that other European powers should not look to the Americas, North and South America, as a place to try to establish colonies anymore. You know, the United States has broken away as a former group of colonies and forming a new nation. And in the 18 teens and 20s, a lot of Latin America was doing the same thing. Different countries breaking away from Spanish control. Well, the United States supported this movement, and to try to discourage any European country from coming back and reclaiming colonies or fighting to keep those colonies, um, President Monroe and his Secretary of State issue this Monroe Doctrine. Now, in some ways, this can look kind of silly that a young country like the United States can assert this kind of authority and say, you better not come back and establish any colonies. That's not exactly the tone, but it is helpful that Great Britain happens to agree that European countries should not come and try to reestablish colonies. I mean, they still have Canada, um, but the Americans will have British cooperation on this. In fact, the British wanted to issue a statement together, but Adams was wise enough to know this will be stronger if it comes from the United States, not a joint statement where we're going to be the little brother to Great Britain. Let's make it an American statement. This is the home of free republics. It is not a playground for European imperialism. And that became American foreign policy. That's really the driving force for a long time, starting here in 1823. So, very significant diplomatic moves by John Quincy Adams, part of the Monroe presidency. Now, we'll look at some things that were also going on at the same time that aren't always part of good feelings. Okay, you might remember this guy here, John Marshall. Probably didn't put a picture of him before, but John Marshall was the Supreme Court Chief Justice as of being appointed by John Adams. He was one of those appointees late in Adams' presidency. He had been John Adams' Secretary of State very briefly, and then he took on this role. And he's going to really dominate the Supreme Court for the next 35 years. He'll serve until 1835. We've already talked a little bit about a very important decision he made and the court made in 1803, the Marbury versus Madison case. That's John Marshall and the court declaring it's really the Supreme Court that determines what is constitutional and what is not. And so they had established this principle of judicial review. Well, the Federalists may not have been in charge of anything anymore, but they did still have influence here in the Supreme Court because it's a Federalist dominated court appointed by George Washington, John Adams, and Marshall is still going to be the Chief Justice for decades to come. Now, I want to highlight just a few decisions that Marshall will make early in this Jacksonian period now that continue to show that there's some Federalist influence. And what I mean is not necessarily the party itself. John Marshall was a Federalist, but it's more their ideas. The Federalist ideas like the supremacy of the national government over state governments, and Federalist ideas like the sanctity of a contract. Once a contract has been made, it cannot be broken just by one party over the other. Both parties would have to agree to dissolve that contract. These are some Federalist principles that will continue on in a John Marshall court. So, a few decisions. I give you just thumbnail sketches of these cases. The case of Fletcher versus Peck really had to do with some land that Georgia was selling to potential investors and settlers. Okay, Georgia gave up all of this land, what would make up Alabama and Mississippi when they joined the United States. That was part of what they had to give up for everyone to agree to an Articles of Confederation. Well, now a bunch of land has been sold, and many Georgia legislators have taken kickbacks. It's they've been bribed in order to push forward these sales and sell a bunch of land, release it to another land investment company who's going to break it up into smaller pieces and sell smaller pieces of land to potential settlers. Well, um, eventually people find out about the fraud here, and the next legislature tries to just undo the sales, because there were some dirty dealings. There was fraud in the first group of sales. But now this leads to a Supreme Court decision, because the question is, can this new legislature from Georgia, can they just undo all the sales from the first one? Now, what about innocent people who've just bought land and thought they were legitimate? They didn't know there had been some fraud before. Um, what happens to them? Do they just lose that money because the new legislature tries to undo the fraud of the previous? Well, that's basically the case here, Fletcher versus Peck. And the Supreme Court is going to say, no, the new legislature cannot undo these sales. It may have been fraudulent, there may have been kickbacks, and the voters of Georgia need to know those things. They need to know who are the corrupt politicians and who isn't. But a contract's still a contract. If someone bought land for a certain price, they expect, and they should by law, keep that land, even if it came about in kind of a fishy way from Georgia's legislature. So here is John Marshall still saying contracts matter, and you can't have a state government come in and just invalidate all those land purchases that have happened since the fraud. Okay, a similar case, because it involves state powers here. In the Fletcher versus Peck case, Marshall says state government can't invalidate these contracts. Well, now there's also a case involving Dartmouth College. That's one of the Ivy League schools in New Hampshire. Well, since colonial times, when this college was first created, there's been a board of directors, a board of trustees that oversees the school. But some in New Hampshire thought the state should be able to take over this school. It is, after all, the main college, the main educational institution of higher education in the state of New Hampshire. So why shouldn't the state of New Hampshire just take over its main college? So there's a battle here between those who want the state government to just take over the college and those who say, no, this college existed before there was a state of New Hampshire. This college has a charter back from when we were a colony, and it established a board of trustees, and they still choose a president, and they still run the college. Well, one famous individual involved in this case, arguing the case, is a lawyer named Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was, that's not the dictionary guy, that's Noah Webster, but this is Daniel Webster, who's going to be very prominent in the Jacksonian period. And Webster argues that his college, this is his alma mater, really, Dartmouth. He says, it's a small college, it's a small light in all of the lights of our educational institutes. It may be small, but there's people who really love it, like himself. And he didn't want to see the state just take it over, run it as they see fit. Dartmouth's still been a good school, and that colonial charter ought to still be valid. The state can't simply take it over. Well, the court agreed. The court agreed with Daniel Webster's argument. They agree Dartmouth cannot be taken over by the state. Again, kind of like contracts, or in this case, charters for a college. Those things cannot just be invalidated because a new state legislature wants to see things changed. Okay. And probably the most famous of these Marshall decisions in the 18 teens is the Maryland versus McCulloch case. Because this is the one that involves that always controversial institution, the Bank of the United States. Remember, Alexander Hamilton had helped initiate this bank when he was the first treasurer. And, its charter lapsed in 1811. Jeffersonian Republicans were not anxious to restart that. So they let the bank's charter just lapse and it fades away. Then we have this War of 1812. People realize, whoa, a bank might have been helpful for us to get a lot of money fast. So some Jeffersonian Republicans learn maybe a Bank of the United States is a good thing. But it was still a controversial thing. Not all Republicans are on board. Some support it, others still think it's unconstitutional. Government has no right to establish this bank. So even the second Bank of the United States is very controversial. Started in 1816. Well, now, because there are some people in Maryland who did not think that the bank was legitimate, they decided the state of Maryland was going to tax the bank because it had a branch in their state. Okay, the main branch is in Philadelphia, but there's a branch in Maryland, and Maryland decides we are going to tax that bank. So here's the case of Maryland versus McCulloch really has to do with, can a state tax a national institution like the Bank of the United States? And really, is that Bank of the US, is it really legitimate, legal? Well, here the Supreme Court gets to make the decision. And John Marshall says, yes, it is legitimate. He makes the same kind of arguments that Alexander Hamilton would, very federalist here, that yes, Congress had the power to create this bank. It's part of the necessary and proper clause. Congress has some authority to do some things that aren't explicitly laid out in the Constitution. Um, they were reading the Constitution a little more loosely. The Supreme Court is, you see. Um, and furthermore, Marshall is adamant Maryland, nor any other state, they cannot tax a national institution. So, see, Federalists may not be an entity anymore, but through John Marshall, through the Supreme Court, the idea that the national government is still supreme over the states, states cannot invalidate contracts um, and charters. Federalist ideas are still very much present, especially remember this Maryland versus McCulloch case. Well, this might deserve a slide all of its own, but I wouldn't have had many sub points, so I just put it here. It's in that same year, Maryland versus McCulloch case, it was in 1819. In that same year, the United States experiences a major economic downturn, which is just called the Panic of 1819. Um, in some ways, the economy was going quite well. Cotton sales were starting to boom. Um, but because of a collapse in markets in Europe, um, it sets off a panic in the United States as well. And we enter several year period here where there's going to be a real economic downturn. Now, I put it here because one of um, the main thing people will blame in the United States is the bank. Many believe, well, now with the reissue of this bank, it has so much control of our finances, financial markets, interest rates. They are to blame for this panic. Um, so again, the bank was a very controversial institution, and um, so it is blamed for economic fluctuations here as well. Okay, this is clearly, if we're looking for one obvious sign that this is not an era just of good feelings, the Panic of 1819 is an obvious place to look. It creates a lot of unemployment, um, a lot of economic depression there for a few years. Um, Another obvious sign that we're not all in sync together, and this just being an era of good feelings, is sectional divisions, north, south, west, people dividing by region. And the Missouri Compromise is the ideal example of this. Um, you see from the map here, we've got states colored in blue that were already existing. Those in red here are the slave states. The ones in blue were states that no longer had slavery. And in 1819, Missouri had enough people then to apply for statehood. It's been pretty routine. We've had a lot of other new states, Louisiana, um, Alabama, Mississippi. Texas should not be colored in red here. That gets ahead of us a little bit because it did not belong to the United States, nor was it a state. But I pulled this map from the internet, and mainly because it had this Missouri Compromise line. Okay, Missouri was applying for statehood, as many others have already added to the original 13. And this was pretty routine, except for the first time, this congressman named James Talmadge said, let's accept Missouri as a new state only they will um, if they will end slavery in their state or have some plan to gradually end slavery. Now, that had not been a condition for any other new state. No one said that to Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, Arkansas. No other slave state was given that condition when coming into the Union. And this really opens up a can of worms about something that it was an obvious sectional issue. It's obviously a division between North and South, but neither side's really talked about it much. Slavery. Well, now suddenly people are going to be talking about it because here's a Northern Congressman, James Talmadge, that says, yeah, we'll accept Missouri, but only if they get rid of slavery. And then all of these Southern states, the slave states, are going to say, what does that have to do with whether or not a state should be admitted to the Union as legitimate? That shouldn't be a condition upon being a state. It never has been. So there's going to be argument back and forth. Suddenly, we realize a lot of these feelings North and South has had for a long time. They just haven't articulated. Both sides are going to feel like we should never have agreed to that 3/5 compromise. The North's going to be saying we should never have let them count 3/5 of their slaves. That makes the South more politically significant than they should be. The Southerners are going to be saying just the opposite. Why did we ever settle for just counting 3/5 of our slaves? We should have been able to count them all. So this was really quite an explosive issue that suddenly came on the scene 1819 and 1820. Now, some of the previous generation, they're still around. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they were still alive. And Jefferson knew this is really quite a dilemma. The founding generation didn't solve the problems about slavery. They knew it was a problem, but they've kind of left it to future generations to deal with. Thomas Jefferson sees the argument over this, and he's retired now. But in 1820, Thomas Jefferson says, this issue, slavery, is like having a wolf by the ears. You grab a wolf by the ears, and you can't hold it forever, but you can't safely let it go either. It's going to bite you one way or the other. So one person steps forward that we're going to get to know quite well in this section, Henry Clay. Henry Clay is often a politician involved in compromise. He knows the art of compromise, and he's going to try to settle this issue without it becoming more controversial. So Henry Clay, from a slave state of Kentucky, has this idea that we can settle this whole Missouri issue in the following way. Let Missouri come into the Union as a slave state. There are a lot of slave owners already living there. But in order to keep the balance between free and slave states, then we should also admit Maine as a new state, because Maine was, had been an extension of Massachusetts. It hasn't really been its own state. Um, when we learned the 13 colonies, we never talked about a colony of Maine because there wasn't one. That was just an extension of Massachusetts. So here's a compromise. We bring in one more slave state, one more free state, and it's all still even. And then the other part of the compromise was let's draw a line here, southern boundary of Missouri. Let's just run this line. Now, we haven't even gotten to the point where the United States owns this land, but we have the Louisiana Purchase, going up this direction, some indefinite way. This Missouri Compromise line would separate what's going to be free territory and what could in the future be slave territory. That was the compromise, or that was one set of compromises. Once Missouri was let into the Union, the next controversy was their state constitution. Missouri said in their state constitution they would not allow free blacks to come into Missouri. They were going to have slavery, but they weren't going to have free blacks coming in. That was another controversy. And Henry Clay once again provides the compromise. He says, hey, Missouri folks, don't put that in your constitution. Don't say it so explicitly, because it's just going to make people in the North want to block your constitution and block your full admission into the Union. Now, once you are a state, no one's going to pay attention to what you're doing in Missouri. If you end up blocking people coming into your state by race, other states do that too. They just do it quietly. They don't put it in the Constitution. So Clay was still trying to compromise in bringing Missouri into the Union without further controversy. But this Missouri Compromise, 1820 and spilling over into 1821, this was definitely not part of an era of good feelings. We're seeing there's real serious sectional divisions. There may be unity around one main party, but there's sectional divisions that are going to help create new parties as well. Well, finally, we'll get to one more party thing here when we get to an election of 1824. After Monroe had served 2 terms as president, he does what all these previous presidents had done. Those who could be reelected, it was always the Virginia guys that could. He doesn't run for a 3rd term. He just steps aside after 2, like George Washington had. But that means a lot of people who have worked in his cabinet before, or other prominent politicians, some military heroes, will emerge as the next set of candidates. So in 1824, we have a really interesting election with a whole slew of candidates. I didn't even get pictures of all of them here. But there's Andrew Jackson, the military hero from the War of 1812, and we're going to learn a lot more about him in the days ahead. There's John Quincy Adams, of course, Secretary of State, and someone who's really been groomed to be president someday, learning from his father, and he's been in service of the American government most of his life, since he was a teenager. There's also Henry Clay, the compromiser, Speaker of the House, very influential in Congress, and people recognize him as a real political talent, he's able to get compromises done because he's pretty universally liked. Um, he's just one of those people that can kind of talk to anyone. He's intelligent enough, he can carry on real sophisticated philosophical questions, but he can also relate to just common folks um, who want to talk about mundane things. He can talk with anyone and is quite eloquent. Um, and then we've got William Crawford, maybe the least known, probably for most modern Americans now. Um, William Crawford's probably the most like a Thomas Jefferson or the old Thomas Jefferson Republican Party. He's a guy that wants to see very limited federal government, more power to the states, not a strong centralized government. And then one I didn't even have a picture of here is John C. Calhoun, who we'll also get to know pretty well in the weeks ahead, because he too is going to be prominent throughout the Jacksonian period. Calhoun was a little bit younger, but also recognized as a brilliant member of Congress. He had also most recently been a Secretary of War for President Monroe. And he's young enough, he knows I'm going to have other chances at this. So when it was a 5-person race, Calhoun, when he could see he's probably not going to win that, he was the first to back down and say, I'll just be a vice presidential candidate. And by now, we don't have the same system where whoever gets the most votes, that's president, and the next most, that's vice president. They're separate offices. You can't be running for vice president and accidentally become president. So Calhoun is comfortable just becoming vice president, and he figures he'll have other chances to become president later on. Um, now, those are the candidates, but what happens is there is a popular vote for president. We're having more and more people voting now as property restrictions are reduced in the various states. New states usually don't even have any property restrictions on voting. White males, they're citizens. When they're of age, they vote. The older states, the original 13, used to have pretty significant property restrictions. If you don't own enough property, then you shouldn't vote because elections usually have something to do with money and taxes. And if you don't have money or property, then what business is it of yours? That was the thinking. So new states don't have those property restrictions, and the old states are starting to reduce them. So what does that mean? A lot more white males are voting. Now, we've not become so democratic that it includes all women or free blacks or anything like that. But there's a much wider electorate in 1824 than there was, a generation earlier, or just a few years earlier. So there's a popular vote for president, and many more states are letting the voters choose the electors too. Now, that's the only vote that really counts is the electoral vote. Well, in the popular vote, really interesting, Andrew Jackson wins the most popular votes. He's the hero of New Orleans. He has the least political experience of all of these candidates. He had been a representative from Tennessee for one term, so a very short time as congressman, not too distinguished. He's mainly known for his military career. The other three have been in government much longer, um, and certainly more at the national level. But Jackson's going to win more popular votes than anyone. He also wins more electoral votes than anyone. He had 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams had 84. And the others were real close, like 39 and 41. I don't have the stats in front of me right now, but they're very close. Now, what the process was now is because no one had won 50% of the electoral votes. Jackson may have won 99. He beat everyone else in sheer numbers, but it wasn't 50% of the total because there's 4 candidates still left. So what's supposed to happen next is Congress will take the top 3, and then they will vote on those 3 based on states. They'll vote not as individuals, but as states and decide who's the next president. Well, Clay might have had a good chance here if he had been in the top 3, because Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. And he has a lot of friends there. They're going to be the ones choosing the president. It would certainly have been controversial if a guy getting less than half of Andrew Jackson's electoral votes could somehow leapfrog ahead and become president. But it's a non-issue because Clay actually gets last in this election. William Crawford had slightly more electoral votes than he did. But Crawford's not really going to have a lot of support after this either because he has a stroke. So if Congress is going to elevate Crawford, they're basically saying someone who's been debilitated by a stroke should be president now. Not likely to happen. So basically, it's really down to just these 2, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. I think you know probably where this is heading. John Quincy Adams is Congress's choice for president. And Andrew Jackson is not pleased at all. In fact, he feels cheated out of this election. He feels like the will of the American people was ignored. He got the most popular votes. He got the most electoral votes. But Congress still had their way of making Adams president. Jackson's not a fan of the Electoral College after this. But what especially bothers him is that John Quincy Adams, when he's making his cabinet, his list of advisors, he will appoint Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Now, why is that significant? Well, Secretary of State has been a good stepping stone for the presidency for many years. Let's count back. Thomas Jefferson was a Secretary of State before becoming president. Then James Madison was a Secretary of State before being president. Monroe was as well. Now John Quincy Adams, that's the office he held. That's 4 in a row. If you're Secretary of State, there's a really good chance you're going to be the next president. So Andrew Jackson and his supporters were convinced this was a bargain worked out in advance with Adams and Clay, a corrupt bargain between the 2, where Adams could say, you help me become president, use your influence in Congress, and then I will make sure you are appointed Secretary of State. You'll be the next president when I'm done. Now, there's never any concrete proof that this corrupt bargain ever happened. There's no proof that these 2 had a conversation and made sure, yes, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. We'll do this favor for each other. But Jackson people were convinced this is a corrupt bargain. This is what's wrong with Washington. This is what's wrong with corrupt politicians. Truthfully, it may have just been Adams and Clay, though they do have some personality clash, they tend to have very similar policy views. And so if Clay couldn't be elected himself, his next choice would probably be John Quincy Adams. But nevertheless, Jackson feels like he's been cheated out of an election. And he's certainly going to be looking for vengeance because to him, the people were on his side. And it's not just him that's been rejected, it's the will of the American people. Well, just very briefly to end here, John Quincy Adams' presidency, we won't say a whole lot about it just right now. We may get into it a little more later. But Adams definitely was a politician who favored a strong national government. Um, Now, he's not trying to revive the old Federalist again, but there would be charges that that's exactly what he's doing. He's just like his father, the Federalist. But he will, um, he did believe that the national government can do a lot of good things and should be doing things to help promote um, American development, economic development. The national government ought to spend money building roads and canals and things that will help the infrastructure of the United States. Um, John Quincy Adams thought the national government ought to be spending money that helps educate the whole nation. Now, he comes from Massachusetts, and they happen to have already had the most advanced state education system in the Union. But not every place has mandatory public schools. John Quincy Adams is for more national attention on educational matters. Um, and in scientific pursuits. The United States ought to have um, more more money spent on science and create observatories where people can study the stars and see what we can find out about this universe. That's not going to be just a private enterprise thing. The national government should be spending money to do those kinds of things. Okay, so um, again, John Quincy Adams believes in a strong centralized government, and he thinks there's a lot of really good positive uh, things the national government can do for the nation. It's not just seen as a negative. The big government is going to obviously oppress people. No, Adams sees it as something that's potentially very good for our infrastructural development, for education, um, for just development overall as a nation. Um, But all of those things are going to really irritate Andrew Jackson and other supporters of small, limited government. They're going to think, John Quincy Adams, he's pushing nationalism like no one has before. He's trying to revive old ideas like a national university. Um, and they'll mock him for saying we should spend money to create observatories to study the skies, these lighthouses of the skies. Um, he's going to be made fun of for those kinds of ideas. So much of the next 4 years is going to be Andrew Jackson's supporters getting ready to get revenge for what they thought was really a stolen election already. They thought they'd been cheated out of this one. So, era of good feelings? No, not exactly. It's really just more of a transition from one generation's leadership, the revolutionary generation, to now this second generation of Americans since the United States of America has been created. And there's going to be some bitter animosity here, some of it along sectional lines, some ideological lines. They may all be considered Jeffersonian Republicans at this moment. That's the only dominant party. Um, but we'll see very quickly in the Jacksonian period they're going to divide into new parties, one called the Democrats, one called the Whigs. We'll leave it for another time to figure out how people are going to divide and what each of those stood for. That's all for now. Thank you for paying attention, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.